The storm was coming, and no one saw it approaching fast enough. For Emma and her family, this was supposed to be a fun, peaceful day in the woods, a chance to disconnect from the world, but nature had other plans. The sky darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Small, harmless at first, but within minutes, the forest would become a nightmare. "We need to turn around, now. Emma, sweetheart, stay close to us, okay? Mommy, Daddy." One moment of distraction, and Emma was gone. And deep within the storm, something, or someone, had found her first. Emma sat curled up beneath a towering tree, her tiny body trembling from the cold rain that poured down in heavy sheets. Her pink jacket, now soaked and clinging to her, did little to keep her warm. She hugged her knees to her chest, tears mixing with the raindrops on her face. The forest around her was alive with strange sounds, rustling leaves, distant howls, and the low rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. She sniffled, rubbing her eyes as she glanced around. Shadows stretched between the trees, moving with the flickering lightning that illuminated the sky. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of a bush sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She wasn't alone. Something was nearby. A deep, heavy breath sounded from the darkness, slow and steady. Then came the crunch of footsteps, heavy ones. Emma's breath hitched as she shrank further into herself. The sound grew closer, the weight of it pressing against her ears. She clenched her eyes shut, praying it was just her imagination. Then, lightning flashed again, and she saw it. A massive figure stood just beyond the trees, its outline barely visible against the stormy night. Broad shoulders, thick arms, and deep, intelligent eyes staring right at her. Emma let out a small gasp, her tiny hands gripping the wet earth beneath her. The creature took another step forward, emerging from the darkness. Its fur was thick and matted from the rain, its chest rising and falling with deep breaths. A gorilla. Emma froze, unsure whether to scream or run, but her body refused to move. The gorilla didn't snarl or lunge. It didn't roar or bare its teeth. It simply stood there, watching her. Its eyes, dark and searching, held something Emma couldn't quite understand, something almost gentle. The rain pounded against them both, but the gorilla didn't seem to mind. Slowly, it lowered itself onto its knuckles, its massive frame sinking slightly as if trying to make itself smaller, less intimidating. It tilted its head, observing her, curious yet cautious. Emma's breath was shaky as she whispered, Hello?" The gorilla didn't respond. It only blinked, raindrops rolling down its face. Seconds stretched into eternity as the two remained locked in silence. Then, to Emma's surprise, the gorilla shifted closer, just a step. She flinched but didn't move away. A cold gust of wind howled through the trees, and Emma shivered violently. The gorilla seemed to notice. Without warning, it turned slightly, shifting its massive body just enough to block the wind from reaching her. Emma blinked in shock. Was it protecting her? She sniffled again, rubbing her arms for warmth. The gorilla huffed, then sat down completely, its broad chest rising and falling steadily. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't leaving. Emma swallowed hard, her fear slowly melting into something else. Curiosity, maybe even trust. Lightning crackled overhead, illuminating the unlikely pair, a tiny lost girl and a lone gorilla, sitting together in the middle of the storm. Emma's shivers had slowed, though the rain still poured relentlessly around her. The gorilla sat a few feet away, its massive form unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches above them, but the creature didn't flinch. It simply watched her, eyes dark and thoughtful, as if trying to understand what she was. Emma hugged herself, her small hands rubbing at her drenched sleeves. Her teeth chattered as she whispered, I'm cold." Her voice was barely audible over the storm, but the gorilla seemed to understand. It shifted slightly, then turned its back to her, its thick fur acting as a shield against the wind. She hesitated, glancing around at the darkness creeping in from all sides. There was nowhere else to go. No shelter, no warmth, except for him. Taking a slow breath, she scooted forward, inching toward the creature with cautious movements. When she was close enough, she reached out a trembling hand and touched its fur. It was rough, damp from the rain, but warm. The gorilla didn't move, didn't react. Encouraged, Emma pressed herself against its side, burying her face into the thick coat of fur. The warmth spread over her instantly, chasing away the worst of the cold. A deep, steady breath rumbled through the gorilla's chest, calm and patient. For the first time since she had fallen into the forest, she didn't feel so alone. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythmic rise and fall of the creature beside her. She glanced up at him, blinking through wet lashes. "You're nice," she murmured, her voice small and tired. The gorilla huffed softly, shifting just enough to make room for her, but it didn't push her away. Thunder rumbled overhead, but Emma no longer jumped at the sound. The gorilla's presence made the storm feel distant, like it was something happening in another world. She yawned, exhaustion pulling at her small body. It had been such a long, scary day. Her parents would come for her, right? They had to. But until then, she had this. She curled up tighter against the gorilla's warm side, her tiny fingers gripping a handful of its fur. Her eyelids grew heavier, and before she knew it, she was drifting off, the steady sound of the gorilla's breathing lulling her into sleep. The storm raged on. The forest remained dark and unforgiving. But in that small moment, a lost girl and a lonely giant found comfort in each other. Dawn had barely begun to break when Emma stirred, the cold morning air replacing the warmth she had felt through the night. Her fingers twitched against the gorilla's thick fur, and for a brief moment, she forgot where she was. But then she felt it, the steady rise and fall of its breathing, the quiet huff of air from its nostrils. She wasn't alone. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she slowly lifted her head. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest covered in mist. Droplets clung to the leaves, glistening in the soft, gray light filtering through the trees. It looked almost peaceful now, nothing like the terrifying place it had been the night before. Then she heard it, voices, distant but real. Her heart leaped. Someone was calling her name. She sat up quickly, hope surging through her. "Mommy! Daddy!" she cried, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her. The gorilla shifted at her sudden movement, turning its dark eyes toward her. The voices grew closer. Flashlights flickered between the trees. Emma's breath hitched as she realized this was it. She was going to be found. She turned back to the gorilla, suddenly unsure. Would they see him? Would they be scared? Would he run away? The gorilla stared at her for a long moment, then slowly pushed itself to its feet. It was time. Emma swallowed hard, then whispered, "Come with me." But the gorilla didn't move toward her. Instead, it took a step back. "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's okay. They won't hurt you." Another step back. Tears welled in her eyes. He had stayed with her, protected her. But now he was leaving? The search party was close. She could hear branches snapping, hear her mother's voice, frantic, desperate. The gorilla huffed softly, lowering its massive head as if trying to tell her something. Then, without another sound, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Emma's heart clenched. "Wait!" she called, but he was already gone. A second later, the bushes rustled behind her, and strong arms wrapped around her. "Emma!" her mother sobbed, pulling her close. Her father's hands were on her shoulders, checking her face, her arms, making sure she was safe. They were crying. The search team was crying. Everyone was in shock. Emma clung to her mother but turned one last time toward the trees. The forest was still, empty. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled. He had saved her. He had kept her safe. No one would ever believe her, but she knew the truth. Somewhere, deep in the wild, her silent guardian was still watching. Emma sat wrapped in a thick blanket, cradled in her mother's arms as the rescue team guided them back through the forest. Her father never let go of her hand, his grip firm, as if afraid she would disappear again. The storm had passed, but the ground was still damp, and the scent of rain lingered in the air. Flashlights flickered around them, scanning the trees, searching for any sign of what had kept Emma safe through the night. The team whispered among themselves, wondering how a 6-year-old had survived alone in the wild, through a storm no less. No one could understand it, but Emma knew. She glanced back over her shoulder, eyes scanning the trees, searching for a familiar shadow, a glimpse of dark fur. But the forest was silent. He was gone. When they reached the edge of the woods, more people were waiting, neighbors, rangers, reporters. Emma barely noticed them. Her mind was still in the forest, still with him. She could hear the murmurs around her. How did she make it through the night? She's barely scratched, not even shivering. Someone must have been with her. A reporter knelt beside her, microphone in hand. "Emma," she said gently, "can you tell us how you survived out there all alone?" Emma hesitated, her fingers tightening on the blanket. She could feel her mother watching her, waiting for her to answer. She looked at the crowd, then back toward the trees. Finally, she whispered, "I wasn't alone." Gasps spread through the onlookers. The reporter leaned in. "Who was with you?" Emma smiled softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A big, kind friend." Silence followed. People exchanged glances, confusion clear on their faces. A friend? Out here? A ranger crouched beside her. "Did someone find you, Emma? A camper? A lost hiker?" Emma shook her head. "No. He was big. He didn't talk. But he kept me warm. He kept me safe." Her father frowned. "Sweetheart, who are you talking about?" Emma glanced toward the forest one last time, her heart swelling with something she couldn't explain. "He was just watching over me." The adults exchanged uneasy looks, some shaking their heads, others murmuring about imaginary friends, a child's mind creating stories to cope. But Emma knew better. Far beyond the edge of the trees, hidden in the mist, a pair of dark, gentle eyes watched from the shadows. The gorilla stood motionless, his massive frame blending into the wilderness. He had done what he needed to do. A deep breath, a final glance toward the little girl, and then he turned, vanishing into the forest, where no one would ever find him. But Emma would always remember. Days passed, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about him. The world had moved on. Her parents were just grateful to have her home. The news reports had faded, and the rescue team had labeled it nothing short of a miracle. But Emma knew the truth. She hadn't been saved by luck or by chance. She had been saved by him. She sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the trees beyond her backyard. They looked so small compared to the vast forest she had been lost in. Somewhere, deep within those woods, he was still there, her silent protector. She wondered if he ever thought about her too. One afternoon, Emma snuck out to the edge of the forest, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and pine. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Thank you," she whispered. The trees swayed, the leaves rustling in response. Was it just the wind? Or was he listening? She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small object, a red hair ribbon, the same one she had worn the day she got lost. It was dirty now, slightly torn, but it was hers, a piece of her journey, a piece of what they had shared. She bent down and carefully tied the ribbon around a low branch. A gift, a sign, a promise that she would never forget. As she stepped back, a strange warmth filled her chest. She didn't need to see him to know he was out there, watching, protecting. She smiled softly, then turned and walked home, leaving behind a little piece of herself in the place where she had been lost and found. And somewhere, hidden in the heart of the forest, the gorilla sat in the shadows, his dark eyes watching the small ribbon flutter in the wind. He didn't move toward it. He didn't take it. He simply watched, a deep understanding settling within him. She was safe now, and that was all that mattered. The months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Emma played with her friends, went to school, and spent weekends with her family. Yet, there was always a small part of her that remained in the forest, tucked away in her heart. Her parents didn't understand, but every so often, she'd find herself staring at the woods again, feeling that tug, that pull, as if something or someone was still waiting. One evening, as she sat in her room doing her homework, her mother knocked gently on the door. "Sweetheart, there's someone here to see you," her mother said, her voice soft but curious. Emma glanced up, surprised. "Who?" Her mother smiled. "Come see for yourself." Confused, Emma followed her mother downstairs and into the living room. There, standing by the door, was a large man. He looked like he had spent years in the forest, rough, weathered, with a deep tan from the sun and a thick beard that covered most of his face. His eyes, though, were kind. Emma froze, her heart racing. There was something familiar about him, something almost primal. He smiled warmly. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I'm a forest ranger, and I've been following a lead for quite some time. I think you know something about a special friend of mine." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? The ranger leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I believe he's been watching over you." Emma's mother looked between them, confused, but Emma's eyes never left the man's face. Slowly, she nodded. The man's expression softened. "I've been tracking a lone gorilla for months now. A rare sight, even in these woods. He's not aggressive, but he's elusive. Keeps to the shadows. But every time I get close, I feel like he's watching over someone. Watching over you." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She knew who he was talking about. I met him," Emma whispered. The man's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You met him?" Emma nodded, her voice steady now. "He kept me safe when I was lost. He was my friend." The ranger's gaze softened with a mix of awe and disbelief. He took a step closer, kneeling to Emma's height. "You're the one he protected. He must have seen something in you." Emma smiled, the memory of that night flooding her mind. She could still hear the deep rumble of the gorilla's breath, feel the warmth of his fur against her cold skin. He had been her guardian, her silent protector. "I think he knew I needed help," Emma said quietly. The ranger stood and turned toward the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "I've spent my career in these woods, but I've never seen anything like him. I don't know where he's gone, but I'm certain that wherever he is, he's still looking out for you." Emma looked out the window too, her thoughts drifting to the forest. Maybe he was still out there, just beyond the trees, keeping watch. The ranger glanced back at her. "You've got a special bond with him, don't you?" Emma nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I'll never forget him." The man smiled softly and nodded. "Neither will I." And just as the ranger left, Emma felt something deep inside her stir. She didn't need to see him again to know he was out there, still watching over her. The bond they shared was one that couldn't be broken by distance or time. It was something deeper, something unspoken, and no one could ever take that away. As the door closed, Emma turned back to the window and smiled. In the distance, hidden in the shadows of the trees, she thought she saw something move. A figure, large and dark, blending with the forest. Her protector was still out there, and somehow, she knew he always would be.